Hello, and welcome to Human Tech, a podcast about brain science, technology, and the interactions between the two and how human behavior shapes all of our lives. With me, as always, is Dr. Susan Weinschenk. Hello.
Hello.
And I am Guthrie Weinschenk. So, what are we talking about today?
Today we're talking about stories.
Yeah, so normally we release a podcast once every week, or at least that's our plan, but we've had, I guess, such a groundswell of support and interest in the podcast that we wanted to do another one quick to get one out to everyone as soon as we could, so people could have a kind of a taste of what this is going to be. Our last podcast was a bit more on the technology side, which is more kind of my thing, and I wanted to do one that would be a little more in Susan's ballpark.
You're saying I'm not a technology person.
No, you are, but you certainly are much more of a brain science person than I am.
That's true.
Yeah. So stories.
So I was in Brussels a couple weeks ago. Remember that?
I do remember you in Brussels.
So when I was coming back from Brussels, I was on a flight that was going to go from Brussels to Washington, D.C.
Okay.
And the flight had just started. That's a long flight. That's like an 8-hour flight.
Yeah.
It had just started. We were about 20 minutes in. I had just gotten into my Wi-Fi, and all of a sudden, the plane just like you could feel that it just dropped. Like we did a big decrease in altitude all of a sudden.
That's not good.
It's not good. And then the seatbelt light went on, and then the pilot came on and said, "The seatbelt light is on. Everyone, please take your seat and put your seatbelt on." And then, like 30 seconds later, the pilot came on and said, "Corey, please pick up on the intercom."
Wait, but you have to do it in. Corey, please pick up on the intercom, please. Corey, attention, this is the pilot. Is that good?
Kind of like that, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
And then, at this point, like, we start looking at each other, the strangers on the plane.
Right, and all this time, the plane is rapidly...
It's still kind of dropping, yeah.
Yeah, rapidly descending on a spiral of flames.
No.
Did you still have wings on the plane?
As far as I knew.
Okay.
So then about, another 30 seconds goes by, and then there was another announcement, something like, I guess it was Corey, got on and said,
sure.
All flight attendants, all call. I don't even know what that means, all call, but she kept saying that over and over. And then the pilot comes on again and says, flight attendants, take your seat with your seatbelts, do not get up, and at this point we're like, okay, what's going on? I had just gotten into Wi-Fi. I was thinking about, like sending you an email if I could, before we crash.
Yeah.
Telling you where to find the passwords for, my bank accounts or something.
Oh, boy.
So then the pilot comes on.
Did people seem pretty nervous?
It's really weird in situations like that. People get they get goofy. They kind of like are laughing.
They don't really know how to.
They don't know what to do.
To deal with, because it's like it's completely out of their power and control.
And you don't know. You don't know if there's a real problem or not. Then the pilot came on and he said, "We have a problem with our pressurization system. We are making an emergency landing in London in approximately 7 minutes. Please stow all your belongings and." But you see, and I'm like, 7 minutes, right? I mean, we were like we happened to be right over London or very near London. So we made an emergency landing and, we were all fine. But I was just glad that it happened, not over the ocean.
Right. Because the next stop is Reykjavik.
Or something. I don't know.
Yeah. So
that was, kind of exciting, and it delayed my trip by hours and all of that, but everything worked out okay.
Okay.
So, are you wondering why
why did you tell me this story about Brussels?
Because I wanted to tell you a story.
Oh, I get it. Oh, because the podcast is
about stories, because I wanted to talk to you about what was likely going on in your brain and actually the brains of everyone listening in here while I was telling the story.
We are communicating to the audience at a higher plane of something.
Oh, was that a pun? So here's what we know. Here's about the brain science of stories, which I find to be just like fascinating. You know?
Yes. So, tell me all about the brain science of stories.
Here's what we know. We know that when I was telling that story, if you had me hooked up to an fMRI machine, functional magnetic resonance imaging machine, and you could look at my brain activity, you would have seen that there were certain parts of my brain that were active while I was telling the story.
Okay.
And interestingly, if we could hook you and all our listeners up to an fMRI machine and look at their brain activity while they were listening, the two patterns would sync up.
Oh.
So that's one interesting thing, is that when you hear a story, you show the same brain pattern of the person telling the story, which means you're connected in a deeper way. For instance, if I had written that story down on a piece of paper and you were reading the story, it might not be the same level of syncing. The audio part is really important.
Very interesting.
Now, the other interesting thing about brain activity and stories is that we know that the brain really kind of can't tell the difference between an experience it is having in real time and an experience that of the hero in the story. So when that was happening to me, and there would be some stress, there would be some anxiety, there would be relief, right, as I went through the different parts of the story. There might be the feeling that pressure go down, or feeling the altitude, the change in altitude. When I was experiencing that you'd be kind of having a similar experience. Like
really?
Your brain would be firing as though it was anxious, as though it had felt a drop in altitude. Huh. Yeah. So what we know about people is that stories are the natural way the brain processes information, and they're really powerful. So it means that when you hear a story, you have it's a rich experience. I mean, you have an experience rather than when you just, get facts and figures about something. If it's in a story format, it's a deep, richer experience that you're having. So it's a better way to communicate with people than just facts and figures.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, so that's one thing I love about stories.
Okay, yeah, that they're awesome, and that they transcend space and time, and we can connect humans in ways that were not possible.
So
pretty minor stuff.
Yeah, not important at all.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, stories are so normal and natural that I think people don't it's like they don't even realize it. It's like breathing. It's like breathing air.
I saw I don't know where I saw it, and I can't cite it, and I can't even remember the exact numbers, so don't quote me. But I read an article about the percent of human. They broke down all of different types of human interaction, and they broke it down into like the percentages, like a pie chart, and I think the majority of all interactions humans have between each other on a normal day is actually telling stories.
Okay, I know that data.
Oh, okay. It's possible. It's possible I completely saw it from something that
you probably got it from me.
Yeah, I mean that makes a lot of sense. It's a topic we talk a lot about.
You want to know what it is?
Yeah, sure.
It's 65%.
65%. There you go.
65% of all conversations are stories. This is according to Robin Dunbar, a professor in the UK who studies this stuff.
I'm glad my brain remembers such useless information.
Well, if you'd put it in a story.
Oh, then I would have remembered it?
Yeah. Okay. So if we're going to talk about research, though, the next piece of research I want to talk about is about Paul Zach's research on the structure of stories. What makes and how that relates to the brain.
Okay.
So before I talk about Paul Zak and his research on the structure of stories, so I gotta talk about Gustav Freytag.
Gustav Freytag.
Which I might not be pronouncing correctly. He was a researcher in the 1880s, which is definitely before my time and before your time.
Yes, definitely before my time.
And his question was, we have these stories, there's lots of stories, right? The world's full of stories. And some stories are like really good and they really resonate with a lot of people and they last.
Yeah, if you look at, so you got all kinds of stories, the classic Shakespeare stories.
Yeah.
Macbeth, they made a Macbeth movie literally this last year.
And then you got like Greek tragedies, just all kinds of stories. So he analyzed stories going all the way back and then up to what was his current time in the 1880s. And he talked about what he called the dramatic story arc. Okay?
Is that the same arc as Noah's Ark, or is that a different arc?
Different arc. Okay. So he talked about
story pun.
Oh.
Is it like
it is.
Yeah, parable stories. Okay.
So he talked about the fact that
apparently going to be a punny podcast for me.
Oh gosh.
Yeah.
Stories that are powerful have 5 components.
Okay.
They all a powerful story starts with what he called exposition. That's like setting the scene. That's like me saying, do you remember when I made that trip to Brussels a couple weeks ago? Well, I was on
I remember a story, and I don't know where I heard it, about this trip from Brussels where there was this airplane.
Right. And that's the exposition. That's setting the scene. So that's the first thing. So all good stories set the scene.
Okay.
And then the next thing they do...
Dark and stormy night.
Yes. Then the next thing they do is they have rising action, is what he called it. So there's you have either a protagonist or an antagonist. So that would be, protagonist is the good guy, antagonist is the bad guy. So you have one of the two, and there's tension. There's a growing conflict. Okay.
Yeah.
And that in my story, that would be the the messages that start coming out.
Yes, cryptic messages about plane crashes.
Right. And so that's the second thing, rising action. Then when you get to this point of the kind of the top of the arc,
which would be when the pilot says, "Good luck, everyone," and jumps out of the plane with a parachute.
That did not happen. You're misremembering the story. So the top of the arc is the climax. When you have the kind of make or break moment in the story. Mm-hmm. That's the third. Then the fourth piece is falling action, where things start now to resolve themselves, and then the last part is called denouement, which is a French word that means resolution. So what he said was that when stories have these 5 pieces, exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, denouement, then they're more likely to be these great stories. Now, Paul Zak, remember I mentioned Paul Zak?
Yes.
He wrote the book The Moral Molecule. And he studies brain chemicals and behavior. He especially studies a lot a chemical called oxytocin. But he wanted to know, he knew about this dramatic story arc, and he was curious about whether you could see or get a sense of what was going on in the brain during these 5 pieces of a good story. Okay. So he actually brought people into a lab and would show them and tell them stories, and he would draw blood multiple times during the story. And isn't that nice? It's great research. Volunteer today. And he would also, he had them hooked up to measure their respiration.
Sure, like the polygraph, right? Where you got the finger. What's it called?
Galvin skin response.
Yes. Okay. Thank you.
So here's what he found. Okay, he found that when there was that rising action part, when things started happening, the brain would release cortisol. Now, cortisol is the chemical that's released when you're like, there's tension, you're getting ready for fight or flight, you're getting ready. And the brain would actually release that as though, again, the person, the brain was in, it's like the brain's saying, oh my gosh, something's happening, we better get ready, right? Like it was really happening to that person. And then when they got to the climax point, the turning point, if it was a protagonist, and someone that they identified with, a good guy, and here's the good guy right at that climax point, then the brain would release oxytocin, which is the chemical that causes us to bond, causes us to feel empathy.
So I have a question for you.
Yeah.
Do you think that this is some sort of... Do you think there's an evolutionary advantage to this, right? So is our telling of stories almost a byproduct of when we developed language? So the thing is, right, you're on the savannah, and the person comes over to you and tells everyone there is a maybe that's not the savannah, but there's a pack of wolves coming, right? Yeah. Or there's a stampede coming. We need to go, right? So when language was first developed, people kind of it made sense that when you heard the warnings, your brain would start to process the warnings as if you saw them, and that would be an evolutionary sort of advantage.
That's really interesting. I never thought of that, but yeah.
Wow, thank you. I again, as I'll say once, and I'll probably say multiple times on the podcast, to all our listeners, if you'd like all kinds of brilliant insights, like the one you just heard, contact us, info@teamw.com. For hire.
I didn't finish about the brain chemicals.
I'm very sorry, but that was...
No, but that's a really interesting idea, and I think you might be right. I that certainly makes sense. So that, that language... when humans developed language, it had, multiple purposes, right? But definitely, survival, right? It would help you survive.
And people have been telling stories for as long as language has been around, essentially.
As language has been around, yep. All right, so the last chemical that Paul Zak found was that at the end, during denouement, resolution, if it was a happy ending, then people were releasing dopamine.
Very interesting.
So I just find it really interesting that, that stories have this effect on our brain. Now, the other thing we can talk about with stories is we can talk about what Joseph Campbell came up with, which is 7 archetypal story plots.
Yeah, I do want to talk about this.
So if you want to have a good story.
Right. Oh, by the way, we're taking a small detour into Literature 103. So if you're an English major out there, I'm sure I will say things that are incorrect.
Or they could skip this part.
I was an econ major. Please don't skip anything that we have. And subscribe to our podcast. iTunes and all of your...
You tell a story about that. All right. So...
I'm trying.
We know now that if you use the dramatic story arc, that'll make a better story.
Okay.
It'll release chemicals in the brain. But Joseph Campbell, now he was writing he wrote a book in 1949, also before your time and my time.
It is interesting that out of all, there's been so much research that's been happening lately in the field of technology and brain science, and especially about different chemicals in the brain, that kind of stuff. Yeah. And it's very interesting that there's a lot of stuff that from the 50s on, once kind of behavioral psychology kind of became a thing.
Yeah.
But especially with technology, there's not a lot of research that's really lasted that long. But it seems like with stories, because they're so consistent to the human experience, research that was done in the 40s or in the 1880s, it still holds true today.
Yeah, well,
I find that fascinating.
My feeling is, though, that there was this big section of time where we ignored stories. I think I would say well, okay.
Who's we, and what does it mean to ignore?
Okay. I guess I mean psychologists and brain scientists.
Okay.
If you're talking about the research, like hard research.
Okay, academia.
Yeah. Because if you look at a topic, if you think about language, if you think about reading, if you think about vision, if you think about hearing, all the things that a psychologist or a behavioral scientist might study, there's been or learning or decision making, right? There's been this
peripheral vision, which we will talk about in another podcast coming soon.
All these things we're going to talk about.
Yeah, we got podcasts for each one of these.
Well, for all of these things, there's there's been this growth of research decade after decade. We knew a little bit in the 1940s, and then we knew some more in the 50s,
Pavlov,
some more in the 60s, and some more in the 70s and the 80s or 90s, right?
And the fMRI machines.
Stories, not true with stories. Stories, I think, Joseph Campbell wrote this book in 1949, and I don't know that anything happened with it. But
I'm glad he's finally getting his day in the sun.
And then, I should look up when this was. I'm going to say in the 1970s or 80s.
Okay.
He kind of came back into vogue, or came into his own, because his book and his ideas about these 7 archetypal story plots were featured on public television, a series with Bill Moyers. He did a whole series of conversations that were very popular. So that kind of came back around maybe in that time frame, but otherwise, and that's he's not doing hard brain science research. He's
right. It's observational. He's analyzing the types of stories that have been successful over time and putting them in categories.
And then nothing. For decades. It's only Timothy Wilson that I want to talk about in a little bit, because he's done research on self stories, which is fascinating research. So I'd like to talk about that a little bit. He started his work on that maybe 3-4 years ago, 5 years ago.
Okay.
And then it's really, Paul Zach's work that we just talked about is very recent. So I feel like there was this big amount of time where, if you, the only people that were talking about stories were the branding and marketing people who were
and they've always been talking
so they've
stories.
Been a step ahead of
Right. They know that when people purchase things, it's emotional, and what drives emotion, storytelling.
Yeah.
They made that link.
But the research
forever
has taken a while, and it's finally there's research. All right. Anyway, let's go back to can we go back to Joseph Campbell?
Yeah, go ahead.
The Hero with 1,000 Faces. So he wrote this book, and he was interviewed.
The book title again?
The Hero with 1,000 Faces.
There you go.
And he talks about the 7 archetypal story plots. So if you want a story to be successful, you should use one of these 7 plots.
All right,
so
hit me with 7.
All right, you ready?
If you got them, yeah, okay.
I got them. All right, number 1, and this is not in any particular order, but number 1 is overcoming a monster.
All right, yeah. So you got Hercules overcoming lots of monsters.
Yeah. So the protagonist has to defeat an antagonist, a monster, who is threatening the protagonist's homeland.
Now it can be, of course, that these can be fluid, right? So the monster could be a mob boss, and the homeland would be
the monster can be literally a monster. It can be an alien. It can be a mean person. It can be anything.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah.
We're gonna come back to that one because there's a special.
That seems like a very popular one.
Yeah, I want to come back to that, but let's go through the other ones.
Okay.
Number 2 is rags to riches.
Yes. Very easy.
So the protagonist is poor. suddenly becomes wealthy with, though it's not necessarily, it could be money, but it could be power or a mate or something like that. And then in the way he described this one, the protagonist loses everything,
Okay.
but then grows as a person and gets all the important things back.
Right, is that your romantic comedy?
Could be.
Or is that a different one?
Uh,
Or this is more like like the self-discovery journey?
this is like
Like
yeah, but it's a self-discovery journey though that has to do with but it's the back and forth. I'm poor, then I become wealthy, then I lose it, but then I grow.
oh yeah, but then I realized that money is not actually all that. It's family is what's important.
and then I get the money back after I realize that, you know.
Ah, okay.
Okay, so an example I have written down about that one is Cinderella.
Oh, sure. Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense.
All right, number 3, The Quest.
Ah, okay.
The protagonist and friends set out to get something important, and they face lots of challenges along the way, and eventually they triumph.
Okay.
Example I use for that one is The Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
Right.
Though,
All right.
well, okay, I don't want to give spoilers about The Lord of the Rings.
Okay. Number 4,
Even though it's been out for 85 years.
Voyage and Return.
Okay.
The protagonist goes to a foreign place, makes it through many dangerous things that happen, comes back without anything of value except a personal transformation.
So this would be Forrest Gump.
I guess, yeah. And I wrote down
Life
Chronicles
is
of
like
Narnia.
box of chocolates. Sorry, what?
I wrote down Chronicles of Narnia. Were you doing a Forrest Gump impersonation?
I did, yes.
Okay, I'm glad we didn't really get to hear it.
Yeah, I mumbled it because I didn't want to I didn't want to hit it too hard in case it was really bad. But also, if I did a good job, it would be loud enough that people could hear it and think it was funny.
All right, we're gonna move on. Yeah. Number 5 is comedy.
All right, sure.
So the protagonist is somewhat of a fool and gets into embarrassing situations and near disasters, but in the end, triumphs over all the adversities and finds happiness.
No, sure. And then there's pick any kind of dumb comedy.
Any kind of dumb comedy. Yeah. Yep. Tragedy is number 6. There may be a protagonist or an antagonist. He or she ends up with a tragic ending or a death.
Basically, just Shakespeare.
He or she may learn from the troubles encountered along the way, but not enough to be redeemed in this life.
Oh, that's so depressing.
That's why it's a tragedy.
Yeah. My personal favorite would be Macbeth.
Yeah. Macbeth.
That's not.
Dark.
Yeah, it's just.
Yeah. It's not redeemed.
Just dark.
Doesn't turn out well.
Just all ends up in just
everybody
disaster.
Dies. All right, number 7 is.
Spoiler alert.
His last one is Rebirth.
Hmm.
Instead of a protagonist, there's an antagonist. There's a bad guy. He or she learns and is redeemed by the end of the story.
How the Grinch Stole Christmas.
Yes. Beauty and the Beast.
Okay.
All right, so I want to go back, though, to the number 1. The Overcoming a Monster.
Yeah.
Because there's a special version of that that is really important. So here's another little story. When Joseph Campbell was on the Bill Moyer show, and this became popular, there was a young person. I don't know how old he was at the time. He was young. Before he was kind of just starting his career, and he saw that show and he read that book, and he decided to.
He was like, "Yeah, this is a great idea."
Yeah, and so he took the idea, especially of this next one we're going to talk about. So a sub one of Overcoming a Monster is the hero's story.
Oh.
And
what's the hero story?
The hero story has 8 parts. You ready?
Okay.
And there'll be a test after.
By the way, for our podcast listeners, you can write your questions on a piece of paper and submit them to info@thetnw.com, or just you leave the answers in an iTunes review. We'll grade them and we'll have them back before the end of the semester?
No.
Oh, okay.
Okay, number 1.
Yeah.
The hero story.
Yeah.
First thing that happens. The hero is living in his ordinary world,
Doing his thing.
doing his thing, but then he receives a message
Oh.
that calls him to adventure
Oh.
and a higher purpose.
Well, that sounds extremely exciting.
Very exciting.
You're a wizard, Harry.
Right.
Sorry.
Number 2. He's often reluctant to go on the adventure.
Yeah, Harry didn't really like his step-parents, so maybe not.
Maybe not. Number 3. He has an encounter with someone wise who encourages him to take the first step.
Okay.
Number 4. He faces some kind of test.
Sure.
Number 5. He encounters helpers.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Gang of buddies.
Number 6. He has to undergo a harrowing ordeal.
This is starting to sound like every single action movie, sci-fi movie like ever made.
And that's not accidental. Number 7. He is successful and brings back some kind of treasure, which might be an actual treasure or might be a metaphorical treasure. Knowledge, understanding. Peace,
Is safety? Is safety a treasure?
Safety would be a treasure.
Yeah, because I was thinking about like every single like superhero movie that's come out in the last couple of years, like the Avengers and Iron Man, where the treasure at the end for the most part is like New York is not like a burning pile of like ruin.
And number 8, the last one, is he is transformed and he brings the treasure to the rest of the world.
Okay.
So the young man who heard about the hero's story from Joseph Campbell, do you know who it was?
No. Enlighten me.
George Lucas.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
What story did we just describe?
Right. You got Star Wars, Indiana Jones. Yeah. Sure. That makes a lot of sense.
You know, after George Lucas made all these movies and became famous and wealthy and entertained us all immensely, he met Joseph Campbell in person before Joseph Campbell died. So
just be like, thanks for the billions.
It would be an interesting conversation, yeah.
So here's an interesting sidebar to George Lucas. I live in Chicago, and it's currently up in the air, but George Lucas wanted to build a storytelling museum in Chicago.
Really?
Yeah. Now, the museum would essentially just be art. It would be an art museum with a bunch of like Star Wars memorabilia.
Why is it a storytelling museum?
Well, that was the whole thing. Is that from the outside it's just an art museum, but from the I guess the approach would be all about telling stories, the art of stories and stories and culture and history.
Is this going to happen?
Okay, so it was all signed and delivered. It was gonna happen in the parking lot of the Chicago Bears, the Soldier Field Stadium parking lot. Was where they were gonna put that, right on Lakeshore Drive by the lake. It was like all ready to go, and then there was some problem, and the city's like, I don't know, and then he's like, well, we'll just move it. But then I'd have to look it up. I'm 90% sure that it'll happen still. Because the city of Chicago is not dumb and wants Lucas to spend $1 billion to build a beautiful museum right in the middle of everything.
I'll go. That would be an interesting.
Yeah, so it's a story museum. So this is very, very relevant.
That would be really exciting. We're gonna have to find out where that's at.
And again, I really hope that they have all the. What I would like to see is an exhibit of potential names for sequels for adventure stories.
Yeah.
So again, right, you have like The Story Strikes Back, The Story Goes West, Return of the Story, The Story 2. Yeah, that kind of stuff.
Story. All right, let's get back on track. So, so if you want to have a popular story, if you want to grab attention, if you want to get people to really listen, to remember what you're telling them, if you want to get an emotional response out of them,
yeah,
if you want them to like your product, if you want them to feel that your product or service or technology or software or app or website is relevant to them, you want to use stories. And that can be video, that can be audio. We know that audio is very powerful because of that brain syncing thing. So video, audio, you can tell a story in text, but it's not as powerful.
So, yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about. I'm going to talk a bit more kind of at the end about self stories.
Yeah.
And I want to, this, it ties into self stories, but we're not going to get there quite yet. And for those listening, we're going to mention self stories, but we don't have time in this podcast to do it. So we're going to do a whole nother podcast on self stories, because self stories are a great way to understand us versus them, and why we have countries, and why we have all kinds, like racism. Like there's all kinds of very interesting metaphysical ways we can go with self stories. So that's a whole nother podcast. But I just wanted to talk a little, kind of bring it up because in most of the major cultural institutions in the Western world, at least, there are these traditional classical story types that weave into the narrative that is made for all these institutions. So I'm going to give a couple quick examples. The first is, look at technology. Like every single way we interact with technology is framed in the way of a story. So, for example, you got back, what technology company do you like to associate with? Back in the 80s and 90s and even 2000s, Apple was like, we're the underdogs, right? We're trying to defeat the monster that is IBM or is HP, or is Microsoft. And, you cheer for us, because this is the quest that we're going on to defeat this monster. And, often, another thing we've talked about before is the idea that when companies want to market to someone, and not even marketing, even whether they do it consciously or subconsciously is kind of irrelevant, but when how people view different technology companies, the way it's framed is you're going on a quest, right? You need to conquer this challenge, whatever it is, and the technology is like your tribe. The company that you're using is the tribe that you call on, right? So I need to I'm starting my own business, or I'm getting a new computer to do this thing, whatever it is, right? I'm gonna go on this quest. I have to defeat this monster. Who's gonna be my ally? Who am I calling on to go to war with, right? So if you're an Apple person, you call on Apple, and if you're a Google person, you call on Google. But it's all part of this, like, just the story arc. Where they're not the story. You're the story. You're the hero.
But you're using the technology as one of the friends that
exactly
that is taking you, that you take along, right? I'm thinking about some of the Google has a whole bunch of videos on YouTube. They're like 2 to 3 minutes long, and they're all stories about people who were facing a monster or going on a quest, right? And
they do a good job with that.
And they, the something about there's one about there's an old man in India and his granddaughter, and he's always telling stories about his best friend that he lost touch with, and so the granddaughter uses Google search to find this guy, that they haven't seen each other in like decades. Or there's one about a big flood that happened. And this one's a true story. That actually, that other one might have been a true story too. But there was a big flood in Australia a couple of years ago, and the rescuers used Google Maps because they couldn't see the roads because everything was flooded. But Google Maps would show them a straight line to go to. So yeah, they have these, and they're great. They're really well done, and they have a dramatic story arc,
And I know there's on the national one, like for those of you listening who may not have seen, most of those were kind of longer form for like on YouTube kind of stuff, but definitely for like national commercials that they've done. There's the one where like there's the two parents, they meet, and it's like the story where it's like what to say in a first date is like they type the different things in the Google, and then they have in the Google search bar, and then it's like like how to change a diaper, right? It's all kind of cute.
Yeah. So yeah, it's powerful. It works.
So one thing, another thing I wanted to bring up was, I remember that. So let's talk a little more about the marketing side specifically.
Yeah.
That because we're kind of talking about ideas, but people who do ads and do marketing definitely understand all of this. And I remember, and I'm sure our audience does too, not this year, which is 2016, but last year, 2015, for the Super Bowl, like every single ad was just tug on the heartstrings, like sad and epic. Like that was what was in vogue this year.
So were they all like...
There's like a pendulum that swings back.
Well, they weren't tragedies.
No, they weren't tragedies.
They had happy endings where the dopamine could be released.
Oh yeah, but they were just, they were just so just like, there's like the two people find each other. The dog is lost in the storm, and making little whimpering dog noises.
The other interesting thing, though, about having a happy ending,
yes,
and having a dopamine release, people think about dopamine. We're gonna have an episode of our podcast where we talk about dopamine.
Cool. We got a big list of these episodes.
We have a really big list.
That's good. It'll keep us busy.
But one of the things that's kind of often misunderstood about dopamine is it's not just the feel-good chemical. It actually, when dopamine is released, it makes you seek more information.
Right.
So have you ever finished watching a movie and then you're like wanting to look up information about, if it's a true story, you want to go, you're Googling about the characters in the movie, or you want to go look up something about the movie, or right? I mean, it's like you're...
You know what I actually found myself doing?
Oh, what?
If there's a movie that I'm very much looking forward to,
yeah,
like when it starts,
yeah,
I want to go like do a bunch of research about it. Like when I see my favorite character,
yeah,
I'm like, oh, what else was he in?
Well, I will tell you then, even though this isn't the episode on dopamine, I will mention that the other thing dopamine does, besides make us seek, is it has to do with anticipation. So we'll come back to that in another episode. But all right. So we were
tying in stories with uplifting music and dogs finding horse friends, and with dopamine. So my theory, though, because they don't do that every year, and so my theory is that it was too much. Like every commercial, which is so just like touching, and people just couldn't handle all the feels all the time. And so then they would tune out. So
I wonder if whoever...
funnier.
Well, the thing is, though, that they don't... I mean, these different companies don't get together and say, hey, this year, let's use a story arc.
No, but it's like... But it's, they see what's kind of in the pipeline, and they kind of see what's working. They try to imitate.
Yeah, I that would be interesting to know how much they know about the research. I'm sure they know about some of the research.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm sure the big ones for the major Super Bowl commercials. But I know like for this year's Super Bowl, there's a little bit of that, but there was a lot more kind of like funny stuff, more engaging commercials. That were just not
necessarily
the pulling on the heartstrings.
Pull on your heartstrings.
Yeah, babies and people finding each other, and
babies and dogs.
And That's by the way, for those of you who want to sell anything, babies and dogs. That's if there's anything you want to take away from this.
Or sometimes cats, but
cats, yes, cats as well. Pets in general.
Pets in general, yeah. All right. Do we have time to talk a little bit about self stories?
Yes, man. We did not cover nearly all the things we should have talked about in stories, but the time just goes so fast.
It does, but we can come back to it and do more.
Okay.
But before we end this one though, I do want to talk a little bit about self stories because that is such a fascinating angle if we're talking about brain research and behavior. So it turns out that the best way to get someone to change their behavior and get that behavior change to stick is by getting them to change one of their self stories.
Okay.
So we all have stories that, and we'll go into this in a lot of detail later in another episode, but we all have stories that we tell ourselves about who we are and why we do what we do. And most of this, by the way, is unconscious. You know, we're not necessarily aware of it. But those self stories that are operating really affect our behavior. So if you can change someone's self story, you can change their behavior. Or if you can change your own self story, you can change your own behavior. And do you know how long it takes to change a self story?
How long?
Because this is a change that might last the rest of your life. How long? You'd think it would take like days or weeks, half an hour max. Well, not necessarily. But you could do it in half an hour if you do it right.
Yeah.
So there's research about this. The guy who's done this research on self stories is Timothy Wilson. He's just an amazing behavior science psychologist researcher. I love all of his books. He wrote a book called Strangers to Ourselves, The Adaptive Unconscious, which is, I know we're going to talk about that book. But he also wrote a book called Redirect, which is the one about self stories. So
okay.
It's just I think fascinating stuff. So we will come back to that. But again, just to point out how really, really important stories are in our lives in ways we may not even realize.
Yeah, I mean, there's something. It's just so primal, and I just think back to those traditional story arcs, that the 7 story types.
Yeah.
That were defined that we use. I mean, if you get rid of all the modern stuff and the superhero stuff, and basically all of those exist like when we're living in caves. Like we're there, we're scared, we have to go somewhere else. There are things trying to attack us and eat us.
Yeah.
There are the internal kind of struggles that we that hang out. Like all that stuff can happen from at a very kind of primitive level. So I find that very fascinating.
So you're saying that these are not like this is not just archetypal story plots from modern living.
Well, so that is a question that I did have, right? So there's, and I've asked you this before, but we talked about it a little bit before. But the question was in this research, right? Is there anything that transcends culture, or is this very much a Judeo-Christian Western linear time view of everything? So because here in the Western world, especially the Christian Western world, which is the Western world, right? We've been influenced from the Greek storytelling, obviously the Bible, and that's their tradition, and that's how we've kind of identified with stories. And so I'm curious if these same 7 types hold true in other cultures, and I have a sneaky suspicion that they do, but I'm wondering if you have thoughts.
Well, it's an interesting question. And I haven't seen a whole lot of research on it. I'd like to maybe check out the research on it. I think that some of the, when we were going through the 7 archetypal story plots, we were giving examples like, Cinderella or Star Wars. And I think the way that each of those story plots, the specifics of them, might be culturally related, but you could tell the story of overcoming a monster in a Western way versus
Right. What's the monster? What's the hero? What's the
what happens. Yeah,
yeah?
what's the tragedy? What is what does tragedy mean, right?
Right. Right.
What is a challenge, and so maybe just people living in one part of the world, what's a challenge is different than people living in another part of the world.
But challenges are universal.
But challenges are universal, and I think and monsters are universal. I mean, when
allies are universal.
Allies are universal. When you think about, I mean, like Bollywood, right, in India is, I mean, these archetypal story plots of Bollywood. I think they're in some of the, old Chinese stories. I mean, I think that I, I think they're in. If you just look at the sacred texts around the world, the religious texts, you'll find all these stories.
Yeah, right. The parables, the stories, they all kind of.
I mean, in whatever religion it is, they've got stories that are like this. So I'm sure there are some differences, but I think this is probably pretty universal.
And that makes sense to me because, and you can correct me if I'm incorrect. Which, by the way, I often am. So this should be no surprise to anyone. But because language, there are universal truths about language in the way that that we evolved to use language and the way that we use words. So it would make sense that that kind of commonality and the way our brain processes words and the way brain processes stories is rather consistent because it is part of it's consistent in our brain topography. Is that a correct phrase? No, but
yeah, I would watch out for that one.
Okay, but the location in which things happen in the brain and the way things are related. Does that make any sense whatsoever?
No, not really.
Okay,
that's why I'm the brain scientist.
I tried.
No, but I think I understand what you're saying.
I can tell you how Linux server works.
And I think this goes back though to what you said about the primal parts. So these archetypal story plots really evolution. We've mentioned this I think in the first episode of the podcast. Evolution is slow.
Yeah.
And so even though we've evolved different languages and different cultures, right, and different stories, it's kind of all based on that similar, surviving, finding meaning in the world, and these are just things that all of our brains do.
Yeah.
Regardless of culture you're in. So, like I said, I'm sure there are cultural differences. And they would be interesting to study that, but my guess is it's pretty universal.
So I have some homework for our audience, and this is not joking.
I thought you had
homework.
Homework for me.
No.
Right, for the audience.
But this is real homework that everyone should try.
What?
So in the next week,
yeah.
You should take a step back and take a meta look at the stories that your friends are telling you. So when they're telling you the story about what happened at work, just sit back and look at it. Does it fit into one of the story types?
Does it have?
How are they phrasing it?
Does it follow the dramatic story arc?
And what makes it a good story, right? If your friends are telling you a story you're not interested in,
why not?
Why not? And do the same for movies. Next time you watch an action hero movie.
Or any movie.
Well, specifically action hero movies, because they're kind of all, well. Anyways, any movie.
Or a romantic comedy.
Well, I'm not.
I like romantic comedies.
There's nothing wrong. I mean, that's another. I don't think
You're
there's anything wrong with
You're gonna go watch
being in a standard.
The superhero movie. I'm gonna go watch the.
I'm actually incredibly behind on movie watching. I'm about a year and a half to 2 years behind right now.
You could follow your own homework.
So it's March 29th, 2016. I have not seen the new Star Wars. I have not seen the second Captain America. I have not seen the second Avengers. I have not seen Batman versus Superman.
What you need to do is do what I've been doing, which is these long flights to overseas, because that's when you catch up on all your movies. All right, that's good homework. I like it. Think about, analyze, listen to a story. And what's interesting, of course, is that you will hear lots of stories if you talk to anyone, because that's the natural way we communicate.
I am a babbler. I naturally just talk a lot, and I talk all the time, and I'm always babbling.
Do you tell stories?
I tell so many stories. Everything, even if it's not a story, I turn it into a story. Right. Because that's just how I like to talk, and that's how I think, and that's how I do everything.
So our listeners are gonna listen to a story that someone tells them, and they're gonna see, does it follow the dramatic arc? Does it follow one of the story plots? And was it a good story or not? That's good. I like that. The
stories are awesome. So, all right. So we're gonna wrap things up. I'm looking forward to our Self Stories podcast, which will happen soon. Again, I hope you guys liked this little extra one that we did. Hopefully we'll be coming out with one every week or so. But I don't think we're gonna have a set schedule as of yet. And again, hopefully we'll have some fun guests coming on soon. We're finalizing that. I encourage everyone, if you haven't already, to subscribe to our podcast. You can do it through any of the podcast subscription services, including iTunes or Beyond Pod if you have an Android device, or any of them. They should all work. You can check out our podcast website at humantech.theteamw.com, or just our normal website at theteamw.com. If you have any questions to us, or if you have great ideas for podcast topics, feel free to email us at info@theteamw.com. We're on all the social media networks. Susan, what's your Twitter handle again?
The Brain Lady.
The Brain Lady. You can follow Susan at The Brain Lady. We're also, on Facebook and YouTube if you just search for The Team W.
We're everywhere.
We are everywhere. So with that, I hope you guys have a great week, audience, and we will probably talk to you soon. Susan, thank you so much.
Yeah, talk soon.
And we'll talk to you later. Bye.